As Noya had previously said, even though there is much to celebrate regarding gender in academy, so much is yet to be done. So thank you. Our next presentation is of Dr. Benjamin Reese. Dr. Reese is a psychologist with more than 50 years experience in the fields of diversity, equity, inclusion, and implicit bias. He is currently adjunct professor in psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the Duke University School of Medicine, USA, and president of Ben Reese LLC, a global DEI consulting company. He has consulted to more than 100 schools and organizations across the globe. Formerly, he served as the Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer for the Office for Institutional Equity at Duke University and the Duke University Health System, with leadership responsibility for DEI strategy. The title of his presentation today is Structural and Individual Bias is Often the Culprit. Professor Reese.
Let me try this, and if you can't hear me, just raise your hand. If I can get my slides up. Let me apologize if I seem a little jet lagged. On December 25th, my family went to Australia. We had a great time. We went from there to New Zealand, an incredible time. Got back Friday evening, changed suitcases, and then Saturday morning, this is after 20 hours of flying, changed suitcases, and Saturday morning, I went back to the airport and flew here 10 hours from the United States. So I think I know where I am.
That's a good start.
And I really appreciate, Victoria, your question, because I'm always keenly aware of being a Black man and always keenly aware of my maleness and my male privilege and the lens that I see the world. And that informed my work both for the positive, if you will, and also create some challenges that I'll mention.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear? Good, good. So I've been at this work for a while. I guess it's coming up on 60 years. About 20 plus years as one of the vice presidents of Duke University. And I often feel like I'm in my infancy in understanding the complexities of gender and race. And I always feel like I'm in a learning mode. And implicit bias as a scientific field is really quite young. Most of the significant work has only been done, since the late 1940s, early 1950s. So when you compare that to, I work in healthcare, compare that to medicine, which goes back centuries and centuries, we're just beginning to scratch the surface in terms of implicit or unconscious bias. And I'll go back and forth with the terms. We know a lot, and there's a lot of good research already that describes what implicit bias is. A lot of good research, I think, in terms of its impact on decision making, but we're really in our infancy in terms of, so what do you do about it? And I'll make some suggestions. We know that the brain processes a huge amount of data every second. Only a small amount of that is processed and we can access consciously. So just think of that. Most of what we get through our senses is really processed by the brain unconsciously. So we know consciously what we're doing, what we're saying, etc. But what we do, what we say, our attitudes, our behaviors are influenced by all of that data that's out of awareness that's in the background. And so that sets up sort of the description of what unconscious or implicit bias is. All of that stuff that's out of awareness, but influences the way we live our lives and the kind of decisions that we make. I'm going to ask you in a moment, as a group, to call out, to read that first column and then that second column as fast as you can on the count of 3. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Faster, faster. So what we know is that in our past experience growing up, RED and the way it looks have been paired, associated. And so we don't have to think consciously about that. We don't have to deliberate. It just rolls off our lips. I mean, it's a kind of association that we've been used to. It's been ingrained. You can think of the associations to maleness in science, femaleness in science, So this is the associative process. Don't have to think about it. It's there. I'm going to ask you to do this in a second, but try to do it twice as fast on a count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Faster, faster. So they haven't been associated. RED, when it looks yellow, those haven't been associated in our past experience. So just think of that in terms of the kinds of associations that we grow up with and we live with as adults throughout the world. I mean, associations that we learn from our parents, other adults in our life, certainly the media, all the ways in which we learn about what's associated with being black, being white, being female, being transgender, etc. That's the way implicit bias comes to be. And so any kind of decision that we make is a combination of all the conscious stuff that we know about, and then all of this stuff that operates out of awareness, that's unconscious. This whole study of implicit bias really predates the research in the 50s. There was this neurologist at the turn of the century that focused in on a disease called Korsakoff's disease, which is an organic brain syndrome where you can't hold on to recent memories. And even long-term memory, there's lots of gaps. So you can see someone one day and the next day they come to you and you don't even know who they are. So Dr. Chaparrad was working with this young lady, trying to help her with her Korsakoff's disease. So she came into his office, he reached out his hand, he had a tack between his fingers. So she grabbed his hand and it stuck her and she pulled her hand back. And then he went on to discuss her state of mind with her. The next day, he came into the room where she was. She has Korsakoff's disease. She had no idea who this stranger was. He reached his hand out. She pulled her hand back. She had no idea why she was pulling her hand back. And that started him thinking about, well, maybe there's some past experience that she doesn't have access to consciously, but is influencing her behavior. I mean, that's the power of unconscious bias. And so we know that all decisions are a product of all this conscious stuff, but more importantly, in terms of my work, is the unconscious stuff. Let me make some comments about how this unconscious stuff gets developed in people. One of the things that we know about, let me even go back a slide. One of the things we know about the development of implicit bias is that the precursor of implicit bias actually starts in infancy, where you see infants beginning to make some kind of discrimination between stimuli and environment. For example, when you track the eyes of infants at about 9 or 10 years of age, they will stare longer at faces of the primary caregiver and people who look like the primary caregiver. I mean, a kind of, they're infants, if you will, we think, quote, preference. And then in the months after that, they will stare longer at faces that have the complexion of the primary caregiver, not about race. But it's already this kind of preference, if you will. And then certainly young children, there's lots of research that show as, contrary to the stereotype of kids see no gender, kids see no race, they see gender and they see race. And so there's lots of research that we could talk about in terms of the development of implicit bias in children. And as I said, other adults, books that kids read create these associations. I mean, from my perspective, children's books continue to promote gender inequity. There's been lots that's been done in the last, 10 years, but boy, you read books, you go online, you watch movies, there's still these strong themes of gender inequity. And lots of us, myself included, spend lots of time online. And when you look at this stuff online, in subtle ways, gender inequity comes through. A lot of us are beginning to become increasingly aware, and some of you are probably working in areas related to artificial intelligence. Many of the scientists, most of the scientists who work in the area of artificial intelligence are male. And so there's no surprise that bias, gender bias, is in so much of the outcomes of artificial intelligence. I went online a while ago and I put in the words in my Google search, famous writer. And then I clicked on images. And about 2/3 of the images of famous writers were men. And I wondered, so who was working with the algorithms in Google to, contribute to that? Then I put in the words university faculty in Google, clicked on images. And there, roughly, you look at the first 30, 40 images, about 30, 35% are women, or appear to be women. But in the United States, most of the data indicates that 48 to 50, 55, almost 60% of university faculty at all levels are women. And so how come only 30 are showing up, when I look for images online? Somebody is working with these algorithms and creating these kind of outcomes that people view and use. That's the subtle nature of implicit bias. By the way, I was doing a presentation, I'm glad you mentioned microaggressions. I was doing a presentation on microaggressions several months ago. And one of the ways in which people talk about microaggressions is that like these tiny paper cuts, and they accumulate and they have a larger impact. So I was putting together this PowerPoint slide, and I wanted to have a picture of a finger having a paper cut. So I put in paper cut on fingers, and you can do this on your own. And of the first 30, 40 images that came up, every single finger appeared to be white. So Google allows you, they encourage you to write to them and tell them about, quote, errors that you see. So I wrote to Google and described this. I've yet to hear back from them. And I checked again last night, put in finger with paper cuts, and it's still the same thing. So I have no sway, no influence with Google. So all of us, without exception, around the planet, we're all human, have the propensity for unconscious or implicit bias. There are some factors that sort of influence the degree to which implicit bias shows up for each of us. So we know that those people who are interested and motivated to try to become self-aware of their biases tend to show a decreased level of implicit bias. We know when you work fast, as lots of us have to do under stressful conditions, that's fertile ground for implicit bias. We know that when you're tired or emotionally stressed, your executive functions are sort of down, implicit bias shows up. Several years ago, I had a family member who had a serious medical condition and had to have a very complex, serious operation. So the family was at the hospital, me included. We're on the third floor of the hospital, outside the room that he'll be brought to after this serious operation. And we had been up all night. I was tired, I was stressed. Long hallway, at the end of the hallway was an elevator. Every time the elevator door opened, could be the doctor coming to tell us how the surgery went. When a man came out of the elevator, I found myself looking to see if that was the doctor. When a woman came out of the elevator, I found myself not looking. I said, wait a minute. I've been doing this work for 50 years. I do most of the housework, cooking at home. I mean, I'm trying to work with my maleness, but under this deep, heavy level of stress, being tired, executive functions were down, and all of this early learning that's still there came through, and I was looking for the male doctor. Also, when there's no, quote, objective standard and you're left to make your own personal choice decision, fertile ground for implicit bias. I know working in healthcare, one of the things that we know is that when women go to emergency departments in the United States, I don't know to what extent this is true globally, and they have migraines or persistent headaches, that women, particularly Black women, get less medication for seemingly the same level of pain. So physicians sit down, they listen to a woman describing her headaches, and then they prescribe lower levels of medication for women than men with headaches. And it shows up particularly for Black women. When you simply have a protocol, say a 1 to 10 scale, and if someone says their headache is at a 3, they get this medication. If they say it's at 8, you prescribe another level of medication. We find greater equity. But when physicians are left to their own, just listening to someone, fertile ground for bias. We know when tasks are complex, bias shows up. And then certainly when you've had life experiences that promote, reinforce either gender equity or gender inequity, that influences implicit bias. So implicit bias operates for everyone all the time to lesser or greater extent. So when I think about some of the impediments, some of the hurdles to gender equity in higher education, lots of the programs that we'll hear about today are incredibly important, but also the potential for unconscious implicit bias among people who say all of the socially appropriate things, who believe them consciously, but are human with the potential for unconscious bias seeping through. And so one of the things that I've done in my work, my time at Implicit Bias, because of some major incidents, the last 11 years or so as vice president, I had the happy task and the burden of being on every single search committee for a senior administrative officer at Duke University, and many of the faculty searches. And then in my consultant role, I continue to do that around the country. One of the ways I think about the operation of search committees is in these 5 stages, and this certainly isn't comprehensive. And so I look at the potential for unconscious bias at each one of these stages. So when groups of faculty members get together and they discuss what are the appropriate and useful skills, competencies, experiences that we're looking for the particular position, there's a lot of data about, competencies and skills, but there's also who's in the room, who's describing what the skills and competencies are. How that discussion goes on, and I've been part of that discussion, is also a result of conscious assessment, but also unconscious bias. We know when we get to the stage of that committee reviewing CVs and cover letters, fertile ground for implicit bias. Lots of research done about bias in the assessment of CVs when the CV has a male name versus a female name. Lots of interesting work done around the words that are used in cover letters and the ways in which they, quote, align with stereotypes related to gender. So there are some companies that have developed software that they claim that if you put a cover letter through the software, they can create gender equity. But we know that in the review of CVs, fertile ground for implicit bias seeping in. And then certainly the actual CV itself, bias related to the research that someone reads about, as well as the universities that someone has worked at in the past. There was some recent research just a couple of months ago that indicated in the United States about 20% of PhD granting institutions in the United States 80% of the faculty hired in these universities come from just 20% of the universities. It's a handful of universities that are producing most of the faculty. These universities happen to be primarily universities where the senior people are white and male. And so you have this kind of just shuffling around men from one university to another while we are saying we're doing this equitable assessment to try to get the, quote, best people. And we're recycling people around. We know that there are lots of rubrics that have been developed that show promise in terms of creating more objective assessment of candidates. But we know that those rubrics are open to unconscious bias, not only in the so-called quantitative assessment, but when you look at the written descriptions, you see lots of bias, and there's been research done that highlights the gender bias in the written descriptions of someone's skills and competencies. Oops. Technology. Then we have the reference letters. And we know that the kind of words that are in many reference letters, uh, great leadership skills, tough worker, good decision maker, good with collaboration, very engaging and warm. And when you do the analysis, you see that so often the reference letters promulgate gender inequity. There was this study done in 2016. So this researcher looked at about 1,200 reference letters for a geophysics fellowship. The reference letters came from 54 countries. And so this researcher looked at the letters, analyzed them, put one pile of reference letters that had the words excellent, candidate, trailblazer, brilliant scientist, etc. The other pile of reference letters were just good, good skills, productive, knowledgeable. Then the researcher looked at who the gender makeup of the excellent, outstanding references, and found that about 15% of the excellent, outstanding reference letters were for women, and overwhelmingly, the outstanding reference letters were for men. Again, looking at the names, someone writing a reference for someone, consciously believing that they're doing all of the equitable, fair things, but unconscious bias seeping in. And then certainly interviews. We know all of the research that's been done about dress, presentation style, and the ways in which they align with unconscious, subtle bias. So even if you think that the bias at each one of these stages are really 1, 2, 3% of the variance, the accumulation disadvantages women for hiring and certainly for promotion. So what do you do about it? So, as I said, one of the weak part of the growing parts of implicit bias work is figuring out, so what really works, what has some real solid research undergirding for what really works, and we're still in the process of doing that. So here's some things that I've tried with some promise. At each one of those stages, before the interview, before the review of CVs, I have these 5 or 6 minute presentations of research that get presented just in time before that stage. I initially did it, but it's really more powerful when someone, particularly a man on the committee, talks about the research. Lots been talked about, both positively and negatively in terms of education, but there are some good implicit bias education modules and work. And so instead of only suggesting that the head of a search committee go through the education, the requirement should be that before you get on the search committee, everyone on the search committee has to go through the workshop. At Duke University, new faculty, you would say, take an implicit bias workshop, maybe 20% of them would really go sign up. So what I did with the help of a dean, there was this 6-hour orientation, faculty orientation for all new faculty. How to get keys to your office, how to grade, how do you get paid, etc. In the middle of the faculty orientation was 30 minutes of implicit bias education. Every single new faculty member went through it. And, going through the workshop isn't a panacea, but it's an important step. After you go through a workshop, a week passes, a month, 6 months, you often forget, So I've been working and experimenting with a number of sort of tips, stimuli to stimulate the recall of the workshop. Working with some medical school faculty that assess applicants to our medical school. So after they went through, these faculty, after they went through a 5-hour implicit bias workshop, I asked them at the end of the workshop, here are 30 words and phrases I used in the workshop, circle 3 and only 3 that would stimulate recall of this workshop 90 days in the future. They circled 3, I collected all the papers, took them home, did a frequency analysis, came up with the 5 things they said would stimulate recall. I made posters to put on the wall of the room where the faculty gather before they go to do their individual interviews as a way of stimulating recall. In the olden days, when we used to be face-to-face, and we're getting back to it, for search committees, they would get a folder with the CVs. They would open a folder. I had printed on the inside cover some of the key research about implicit bias in interview. One of the strategies that I'm having developed, I went to consult at a school in the United States, went to the provost's office. I thought it was kind of interesting. She had a long table. At every seat, she had a laminated placemat. It had the university strategic plan. So every time you came in for a meeting, in front of you was a strategic plan. So I'm manufacturing some implicit bias key research pieces. So when a search committee meets 5, 6, 7, 8 times, every time they come into a room, it's there as a reminder. Picking up my cell phone is a high frequency event. So I have a picture of a brain and the letters IB on my phone. You know, it's the Premack principle. You pair a high frequency event with something you want to become high frequency. Every time I pick up my phone, I think about implicit bias. I change this about every 4 or 5 months so I don't become habituated and ignore it. So those are just some strategies for recall. And then in the first round of review of CVs, redact the name of the person to try to reduce gender bias, and sometimes even the school. It's not 100%. Sometimes you can figure it out. But there's several faculty members who now routinely do it in their department for the first round. You know, later on in the process, they see the full resume. Maybe that undoes the redacting, but it helps reduce the incidence of implicit bias. So, in conclusion, implicit bias operates for everyone. Even the best strategies are often victim to the power of implicit bias, which operates for all of us. I'm in the 5th year of being a co-PI on a research project. We're trying to develop an educational strategy to reduce implicit bias. The 3 components are, and these are not rocket science: knowledge, self-awareness, so a module on recognizing your own potential for implicit bias, as well as areas of your own personal vulnerability. And then third area is skills and strategies. And so we think if we can perfect this module and it holds up to some of the testing, that it'll be one piece of trying to mitigate the impact of implicit bias. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Reese, for providing us with this knowledge, stimulating our self-awareness, and making us think about strategies and skills. So we do have about 15 minutes for questions, comments, thoughts, or so.
I have a question for Ben. I just heard from colleagues in the Technion. I don't know if she's. Sorry, I meant Weizmann. From Meital. We were in another gathering a few days ago, and it was suggested as a simple method to avoid bias in committees that decides about appointment, to have the papers without the names, or what was exactly the system, Meital?
We are not giving any information about the candidate before he go into the room. So
Yeah, would you think it would be helpful to overpass the bias?
Yeah, that's what I meant about redacting information, and I used to call it blinding. Until I got criticism from some people that in the use of that term, somewhere in there is an ingrained bias that I have. So I'm working hard to avoid that term. But I think that's helpful, taking out the name or school. It doesn't, you can sort of figure out, in terms of race, you look at you look at someone's CV, you can references, et cetera, you can figure it out. But it does help. When I first came to Duke in 1996, I did it for two major positions, I think with some success. So I worked very quickly. I worked with human resources to redo the job description so it focused more on skills and competencies necessary for this position as opposed to all of this university jargon. So if you had the skills and competencies. And then I had some help. I looked at all of the usual and unusual places around the United States where I might find someone, or might find candidates with those skills and competencies. The CVs came into my assistant, Laurel. With a magic marker, she marked out the names and schools, and I had a scoring rubric, and so I applied the scoring rubric, came up with the people I was going to interview. Night before the interview, I looked at the full resumes. I had this rubric for the interviews. And so I hired, I won't mention her last name, Polly. Never worked, this was for a senior diversity manager. She had never worked in higher ed in her entire life. She came from an organization called Gay Men's Health Crisis. But she had all the skills and competencies. And happened to be a white female, one of the best hires of my career. And I did it a second time for Judy, who happened to be a white female who I almost said only has a bachelor's degree. She has a bachelor's degree. She's now the assistant chief diversity officer in the School of Medicine. In terms of skills and competencies, she never worked in higher ed before, but in the corporate world, she worked globally around diversity, equity, inclusion. But I used the same thing. I took out names and schools because I know I would be biased by, as hard as I tried, someone coming with a background of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton who had done diversity work in all three places. Yeah, so it's a long way of responding to that.
Could you pass?
No, I don't need it.
Okay, let's see.
Well, first of all, thanks both of you. Wonderful talks, and I wanted to ask.
Can you also give us your name?
Yes, sorry. My name is Tammy Rasi. I'm from the Superior Academic College. Victoria, you just stole our presentation. Our next. Sorry. Sorry, it's a direct. Okay. No, it was really. You'll hear soon. I think similarities. So many similarities. I wanted to ask you about the policy of affirmative action or diversity programs. How does the UK deal with in the figures you just shown us?
Thanks, Tammy. That's very interesting. It's sophisticated. It really is. We don't use affirmative action because it's illegal to do positive action within the UK unless it's, for example, you want to hire a woman to be in a women's refuge, and then you can legally acquire. So within the university itself, we do look at charters, and so Athena Swan is a charter which looks at gender equality as a framework across the university and across universities. Gender pay gap, as what I mentioned before, is a key thing of looking at what's happening with money and how we get paid, and whether you're going to have 5% more. So if you become a professor, there's A grade and B grade. Most women are going to be on the lower grade and on the lowest rank. So we're very much looking at that. So how do we do it? It is really looking at the charters we've now got in place, where you can get a bronze, silver, and gold. Now, you might think to yourself, oh, well, it's a tick box. Depends on the university, and it depends on how it's being implemented. Athena Swan isn't like it used to be, where perhaps it was really set up for STEM, and for universities to get research money, they had to show that their gender equality framework. That now is headed out into social sciences, so it's across the universities, and it's making a difference. Now, UCL has got a silver across all faculties. So what happens is, it's departments and faculties and institutional. The institutional has to commit to gender equality. Europe, the work we do in Europe it commits itself to gender equality frameworks. That's enabling people to understand that to be able to do your work, you need to be able to show that there is progression. Where it starts to fall apart is when you start looking at women which are not white, because gender has been claimed to be for women which are white. So when we put their hands up and they say, well, we've got 30 professors in our faculty or whatever, and then somebody like me comes along and asks the question, how many of those are not white? Well, that's a difficult question, Victoria, because there's none of them. So how can you be celebrating that you've got gender equality? So that's as part of the question.
My name is Marilyn Safer. I was one of the first person to look at gender equality at an appointed university. I'm wondering about blindness. I'm concerned about women who've taken a break and then go back to work. I know, and I think it still exists, that women over 40, they don't hire them at the university. Now, if you're blocking out school and so forth, but date of birth, you have these holes. Now, in Israel, you have men who've been in the army and they've been out. They don't have any problem getting appointments at the university, starting at introductory grade at age 40, 45, but women don't. Now, how would you deal with that?
Oh, great question. As I said, redacting information is not 100%. Even if if someone says, well, if you're away from the university for a year, we have to count that, in the promotion process. If you're away for a year on sabbatical, or you're away for a year for childbirth, unconsciously, I think that's not assessed in the same way. So you're right. The kind of research that you do, even when you redact names in school, the research, might be a source of bias. Some people have even taken to taking out the names of people on the list of research. And if you're first author, they'll just put in the words first author or second author. They won't even put in the names. I mean, how far can you go? So I think it's a strategy to hold some promise, but it is, as you say, it's not 100%. I have a colleague, Judy, who I hired. Judy doesn't use this at all. She feels that it lets people off the hook and doesn't impel them to sort of, struggle with their biases. You give them this strategy. And so we always have this conversation about whether it's useful or it sort of gives people a way out. They don't have to struggle with the fact that they have their own personal unconscious bias in this area.
I think that Victoria wants
Yeah, I mean, this is an area of real interest, and I think it's a tough one, but I think it's a real one. Many colleagues of mine, which are academics across different parts of the world, we talk about this all the time because of the language of early career researcher. What does that mean? So somebody which does their PhD at 40 and they're not seen as an early career researcher because it cuts off at 40. So if you're a woman and it cuts off at 40, you kind of, well, what are you then? You're nothing. And it's the language which is used within the universities, bright young thing, rising star. And it's all that kind of language which we have to challenge. What's a rising star? So I'm not a rising star because what? I'm not 40. Yeah. Oh, but somebody who's 25 is a rising star because they've just finished their PhD. So it's about the language. And ageism is real within the academy. It's real with across the different things. So what are we doing about that? Well, we're starting to really challenge that. And it's a tough one because people don't want to challenge that because it starts to push their thinking about what's it like to hire somebody which doesn't perhaps look as young as they thought. But they hire men which don't look as young as they thought, and they're okay with that. So I think we do need to push that, and I think it's something we need to push through the intersectional lens of what we're doing. So you're absolutely right to bring that up, and I think it's really important that we include that. And the date of birth is a good one, but then they start looking at your publications. So your publications is the other thing. Oh, they published the book in whatever, 2005. Oh, that means, so was that their first? Oh, it's their first book, 2005. So then they start adding up the hours, the dates that time. But it is a really important question. And the other question around is health. Mental health. Women suffer a huge, I'm very interested in mental health and what's going on within the academy. That's a silent elephant. No one talks about mental health. People have silent breakdowns over the publications, over the fact of your promotion and not being able to promote. And so you get to a stage where you just completely shut down. And many people in this room, I bet you many, if you ask them, not asking you to do it now, you've had a period in your time where you've had a doubt and you've kind of shut down and you realize you haven't been productive for a couple of years. And you can't say it because you're in secret. It's a silence. You suffer in silence for 2 or 3 years. And then all of a sudden people say, oh, we haven't seen you for a while. Or you've produced a paper at last. What happened to you? Well, you know what? I was having my silent breakdown. No one cared. So it's all that type of stuff. But thank you for mentioning that.
Thank you so much. I'm Heidemarie Winkel from Bielefeld University in Germany. And my question has already, I think, partly been answered, but nevertheless, there's still a fight in me. So in Germany, we have a law, and the law focuses on diversity and not on intersectionality. So and we are now, I would say, not only at my university, but everywhere, we are at the point that we understand that diversity also in practice does not work. I mean, it's not fruitful. So, and actually, you already both answered what it means to implement intersectionality as a practice. But nevertheless, I would like to hear something more. From you. I'd like to try to convince people that we should shift. Still, we are still at the point where I think we should shift from diversity to intersectionality, and it's a hard struggle because some people, some colleagues, even think that we now have to share the small budget we have, and I try to tell them no, it's not about giving up feminist or women's rights. It's not about that. So, yeah, open up your understanding of gender, but nevertheless, so I think I would be happy to get more input to make people understand what this shift from diversity to intersectionality means for a practical, on a practical level, for policy or politics in academia. Maybe you could say something more about that.
Yeah, I'll do it very, very quickly and I'll pass it to him. Very, very quickly. I've already taken up 1 minute saying very, very quickly. But anyway, that's a really important point. It's something which I'm working on European projects, and I'm in Germany as well quite a lot. I'm happy to talk to you afterwards. But the key thing is, and in the book, which I mentioned just a moment ago, is that we're at the time you've got to share your microphone with me, because you've had the microphone for a long time looking at diversity. Diversity is just like a bag of sweets. It means nothing. So now to start to think about intersectional and what that means. It means you have to give up some of your cake. As a woman, you've already had the cake. I'm now coming knocking at your door. I want a piece of your cake. And that's what you have to now do. And it challenges you, not you personally, but it challenges women, because they have to share the cake with me now. And there's not enough anyway, but now you have to share it with me. Yes, you do, because I'm also a woman and you need to share the cake with me. If not, I'll take the cake. And so
I agree 100% with what Victoria said. A comment on intersectionality. I think the aspect of one's identity, what becomes prominent, depends on the context. So being in this room, I'm very aware of my maleness. I typically have to work hard to be aware of my maleness in other areas because I'm around mostly men. I'm always aware of my blackness. When I go to historically black colleges, universities, I'm aware of my economic privilege. They say, oh, here's this black man coming from Duke University, this historically white, wealthy institution, and I'm very aware of my economic privilege. So all of the aspects of my identity are important. They're all intersecting, but what's prominent sort of changes depending on the environment that I'm in.
Okay, so one last question, talking about cakes. We will later go to a coffee and cake break.
Hi, I'm Eital. Hi, Ben. Nice to meet you. Nice to see you in Israel. I'm from the Weizmann Institute, and for the last 3 years, I'm the Diversity and Inclusion Office. And I did some of the training you just told us about, unconscious bias training for our admission committees for the students, because we only have a graduate student program. So for the master's and PhD degree, we interview all the students, and the scientists have to go through this unconscious bias training. And in the third year, I feel it's difficult to continue doing the same thing, trying to invent myself in a little bit different way in each year. So this is one question for you. Maybe you have some ideas how to continue the feeling of importance of doing it. And the second is more of a comment. I think there isn't one fit for all. You have to understand very deeply the culture of the institution and tailor the intervention into it. So this is what I'm really trying very hard to do, and it's not so easy.
One size doesn't fit all. I agree. I'm working with one of the major scientific labs in the United States. Implicit bias work is different I'm constantly revising information based upon the new research, because it's a young field. But quote, training other people to do it is really important. You know, in the time that I was on all of these search committees, they would look to Ben to make the implicit bias comments. On some search committees, there was this interesting shift. They would look to other faculty members in the room who would really take leadership. Yeah. By the way, we did a pretty good job of increasing the gender representation on search committees. Not a good job in terms of the leader, the head of the search committees, which is a whole other discussion. Yeah. It's like who gets promoted to senior roles in the academy.
I just want to be absolutely transparent. I don't believe in conscious and unconscious bias. I think there's more issues in relation to that. And I think, again, just like diversity, it's become a kind of a hoodwinked scenario of it's unconscious. But you're not unconscious. People are not that unconscious about their biases. We can actually see that happening when it comes to gender. However, I understand there is need to do certain types of training, but I think I'm just being 100% honest. And I've done a lot of work around that as well. So we can have a conversation about that ourselves. But I think, you know, it's also up front, because we have to also be honest that, you know, people are also consciously biased and not just unconsciously biased. On purpose, exactly.
Purposely.
Yeah, this is going to be a longer conversation.
Okay,
Conscious,
thank you.
deliberate bias, sexism exists. Unconscious bias exists. It's a scientific fact. I mean, it exists, just as conscious, deliberate sexism and racism exists.
Thank you, Dr. Victoria Sharon May. Thank you, Dr. Benjamin Reese. Thank you, everyone. We will have now a 15 minutes break.
Okay, I invite everyone to take your coffee and cookies to your seats. Okay, so welcome to the second session, Challenges of Diversity and Inclusion, a perfect gateway to last session discussion about intersectionality and diversity. My name is Maya.